thank you people for being here for the October Around the World update of the Export Recovery Panel. And this is a webinar series that we started all the way back in March, and it's a collaboration between Catapult and Cell Global. So since that time, we've had a whole lot of amazing guests coming onto the panel, and today is no exception to that. And really, the whole point of this series has been to help exporters navigate these tricky times that have come about through COVID-19. And as we try and figure out how we export in this new world where we can't get on a plane and go to these various countries, and what does it mean for consumer behavior or even business behavior when we are looking to sell into these export markets? Like, who is buying our products, and are our products the right ones? And being able to connect with people on the ground is what has been making a huge difference. So really, the purpose of these here is to give you practical insights as to what is happening in these markets and how you can think differently or act differently about how you go about exporting your product or service to the world. So it's my pleasure today to have four amazing panelists with us. So as I look at it here, I've got Bob Burke from Natural Products Consulting, and Bob will give a fuller, more complete introduction in a moment. And we've got Nick Swallow. He's the Trade Commissioner for New Zealand over in the UK and Ireland. And then we've got Rachel Maidment from the New Zealand China Council. And then we've got Rebecca Smith, who's a director at NZ Story. So we're very lucky to be getting perspectives today from the USA, from Bob, who's over on the East Coast of the US, Nick from London, and Rachel, you are here in New Zealand at the moment, but obviously very close ties into China. So these are three big markets, and also then Rebecca's got a really interesting perspective of what is going on around the world. So look, Bob, it would be great if you could just give a background.
Sure. Thanks, and happy to be here. My name is Bob Burke, and as Hamish mentioned, I'm in the Boston area in the Northeast US. I have a company called Natural Products Consulting. So most of my work is around helping to bring natural, organic, and specialty products to market across all classes of trade, all channels, working with companies of all sizes, stages, categories at this point. Along the way, I've done a how-to guide reference book called the Natural Products Field Manual. I also speak at a lot of the leading trade shows and conferences, both in the US, places like Expo East and West and Fancy Food Show, but also Naturally Good in Sydney and other shows around the world. I also put on my own seminars on both sales and raising capital. I do those a couple of times a year, and they're switching over to virtual during COVID, but otherwise they've been great networking events as well. And I'm privileged to serve on a number of boards and advisory boards of various companies, mostly food companies here in the States. So happy to be here, happy to share some of the things I'm seeing and hearing, and look forward to hearing great input from the rest of my fellow panelists.
Brilliant. Hey, thanks, Bob, and look, very grateful to have you here. And Bob does a lot of great work with New Zealand food and beverage companies, and you'll understand as we go through this here just the depth of experience and knowledge he has. So thanks, Bob. And then Nick Swallow, currently muted.
Sorry, just getting the mute off there. Yeah, so I am New Zealand's Trade Commissioner to the UK and Ireland, based in London. And so our role is supporting New Zealand companies over here. And just excited to tonight talk about all of the exciting things that have been happening over this side of the world in the last few months, and the exciting things that are to come on the 31st of December with Brexit date looming.
Yes, indeed, and we will cover off on that. And thank you, Nick, for staying up late this evening on your
You're welcome,
Wednesday evening. So that's great. Thank you. And Rachel.
Kia ora koutou katoa. I'm Rachel Maidment, and I'm Executive Director of the New Zealand China Council. We're New Zealand's peak body for engaging public and private sector with China. And last year I came back from 3 years as Consul General for South China, based in Guangzhou.
Fantastic. Look, and I'm sure you're grateful to be back in New Zealand, but at the same time, look, that's was amazing. Thank you for being here, Rachel, and look forward to hearing about what's happening with China. And then lastly, we've got Rebecca Smith from NZ Story.
Kia ora koutou. Rebecca Smith. New Zealand Story is a government-enabled entity that helps businesses and exporters to promote themselves to the world with easy tools and support and insights. So we're here to serve the community that's on this call, and everything's free, by the way. Your taxpayer money is going to good use, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in my presentation.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all for being here as well. We're very, very grateful. So I'll just have a quick look at the poll results here, which actually interesting for those that have voted there. There's actually more people that aren't exporting at the moment versus those that are. So that's interesting in terms of keeping in mind for, I guess, people looking for opportunities, because it has been an interesting time for many companies. And I know, like, we get to deal with companies that have, for example, dealt with the tourism industry, and with that now not being anywhere near what it used to be, people having to look further afield. But that's interesting there. Now, but I would like to start with Rebecca. Now, Rebecca, you've recently completed a market pulse survey, which is showing some really fascinating shifts in the perception of the New Zealand story. So I'm going to hand it over to you. This will be an exception, people, in terms of, we've got some slides here just because this is really good to have a look at. So I'll take it away, Rebecca, in terms of sharing some of these insights that have,
That's wonderful.
Have come through.
Great, thank you. I'll just confirm that you can see my slides. All sharing, yes. Okay, great, wonderful, excellent. So New Zealand Story, our goal is to shift perceptions of New Zealand into a broader narrative about New Zealand, which again opens the doors for exporters of all types and shapes. Because historically, as you're probably all very, very well aware, New Zealand has had a very strong reputation for natural beauty and being a tourism destination. It's also well known for food, which is great, we need that, but often very little else is known about New Zealand. And that can be a barrier when we're trying to have those new conversations about who we are, where we're from, and why we should do business together. So we conduct research in our key markets in order to understand what those perceptions are in those key markets, how they differ, and then what we need to do collectively in order to shift some of those perceptions, and what the watch outs are for you if you're exporting or providing services into that country, so that you better understand how to tailor your approach to those different countries. So we've been doing that research on and off. It's all available on our toolkit, which I'll show you a little bit later. But of course, this year has been a startling year. I'm not going to use the other word that starts with you, because that's a bit overused. Let's go with a startling year of change. And so what we thought we'd do early this year is do some pulse research just to check in with consumers and buyers internationally on what's changed for them, and what's changed in their perceptions of New Zealand, and what are some of the watch outs for us, and what are some of the opportunities that we could take advantage of in this strange time that we live in. So this research, I'm very quick to point out, it's qualitative, it's a small toe in the water. What we do find with our qual research though is that it tends to be very representative of people's views. We go quite deep. We use an anthropologist to do this work for us. In this particular case, we did 7 consumer focus groups and 10 B2B interviews, because of course a lot of what we do internationally is business to business, and trying to get into distributors and retailers and buyers and otherwise. I will just say that we did all of this research online through Zoom. And we typically would go into market and do these groups in person and sit behind the one-way screen and watch them. We did it on Zoom instead. And if any of you think research is expensive and hard to do, I can tell you that this is game-changing. Having people on Zoom, we had simultaneous translation, we had a facilitator, we recorded everything, we were able to go back through it and really dig through all the results. It was outstanding. So if there's one thing positive that's come out of this year, it's that you can do online research far more cost effectively and quite quickly. So I'm going to dive straight in. This is going to be a really quick once over. The full deck is about 69 slides, so I'm going to do a really quick once over. We are going to make this research available on our website, so you will be able to get access to it. And if you've got questions, of course, you can ask me directly. So I'll dive straight in, she says optimistically. Sorry. Okay, so the key changes that I just wanted to share with you, and these won't be too much of a surprise for you because I'm sure that you've been feeling them domestically as well, is that people are really starting to appreciate the space that they inhabit. So we heard about people really getting a better sense of home, that it's more desirable than ever, and they're starting to explore more. So just as in New Zealand, you start going for those walks during lockdown, discover that great place at the end of your cul-de-sac that you never knew existed. That's happening all over the world as well. It has brought people and communities a lot closer together, and we heard a lot of people say that they value that a lot more. So really physical connection was the only thing that was holding them back. Many of them have become more flexible and more inventive with their communication styles during this whole pandemic. It's also strengthened their sense of national pride, and this is, you know, we're seeing that here in New Zealand with a sense of buy local, support local. That's happening everywhere. And that's something I'm going to talk to a little bit more about. So there is, though, this overall sense that there's a feeling of hope for the world and a sense of optimism that's coming through that. Now, I will caution by saying that's obviously not the case in all markets, just the ones that we research. There are some countries and some cities that are going through a terrible, terrible time where that optimism isn't so prevalent, and I would say that South America would be probably one of those areas right now. But there's certainly a sense of sort of great social, cultural and political change. You know, this research was done at the time of the Black Lives Matters movements, and a lot of people around the world knew that New Zealand's Black Lives Matters protests were all peaceful, and that stood out for them. There's a real shift from what's entertaining to what's enriching. We were hearing people talk, what can I do that's better for me, better for my family, better for the good of the world, not just frivolous or entertaining. And a sense that the way that the globe is dealing with this pandemic could mean that we deal with other issues in a more positive light too, things like climate change. But while there was quite a lot of hope expressed when they're thinking about their own countries, they were quite scared. And we found that there was a sense of sort of growing social, cultural and political divide occurring in a lot of these countries that we interviewed. So the sense of national protectionism, but wanting to be part of a global team. So really polar views on that. A sense that we want to be, you know, a community, and there's a role for us to play in terms of the collective good, but don't mess with my individual freedom. You know, again, a very a polarized view there. I want to make sure that what we're doing is good for humanity, but how do we balance that with something that's good for the economy? And of course, we're hearing that in our own country as well. So I just wanted to emphasize that those sort of dichotomies are occurring around the world for consumers everywhere. So what we can see is that the response to the pandemic has been far more values-based than ever before. It's become a lot more of an emotive response to the pandemic than a rational response. The good news is that through all of this, New Zealand is no longer just epic landscapes and Lord of the Rings, thankfully. We've started to move on from that. This was done at the time, the research was done at the time when we had cleared all our cases. And that was very well known throughout all the groups that we interviewed. People were very aware of the media coverage around that so-called success. So, you know, we don't like to speak too soon about it. They knew that we cleared, and some of the terminology that we've been using here in New Zealand came through unprompted in this research that we were doing. Things like a team of 5 million, the concept of bubbles, the levels, that really had cut through a lot more into the consumer space than we imagined it would, including in the US, which is typically a nation that doesn't tend to observe a lot of what goes on in smaller countries like New Zealand, but we certainly were hearing that unprompted. And as a result, they had a much greater awareness that New Zealand was actually different, and particularly different to Australia. And again, there are benefits at times of us working together and being seen as one, but there are also some really distinct disadvantages, particularly around our export capability. So New Zealand was certainly seen as marching to the beat of its own drum and a lot more independent. So on the left-hand side there, you can see sort of this is what we have. This is typically how we would be described by consumers generally. They'd always talk about our landscapes, our nature, our agriculture, the fact that we're friendly, there's fresh air, there's white wine, but it's a little slow and sometimes a bit sort of small. And again, that's a generalisation across all the research. But what we've found through this is that people were talking about New Zealand as being a lot more forward-looking. The level of respect that was coming through, that we're different, that we're solving problems, that we're quite ingenious and creative and more sophisticated. And these are really hard metrics to shift for countries, because those things that we think about other countries are quite deeply embedded in our brains. So quite interesting that through this whole approach, people were going, actually, New Zealand's a little bit different to what I expected. It's a bit more forward-leaning and kind of interesting, and I'm curious. So I want you to remember that word, that people are really curious. But there are a couple of watch outs. And again, if I revert back to COVID, you're an island, you've got no shared borders. God dealt you a great hand. You're not in the middle of the world like we are in Germany or in Japan. You're obviously quite small and must have a spread out population because you didn't have many cases, and you start a little bit behind other countries. So whilst they were very positive about New Zealand, they were like, don't get too big for your boots, because you had a couple of natural advantages in this space, so don't get ahead of yourself. And some of the watch outs for us, and particularly when you're talking to people in other countries, is that the impact that can have is that they may have thought we were small before, now they think we're smaller. We must be, because we didn't have that many cases. They thought we were possibly expensive before, now we're feeling a little bit less obtainable. And this is a bit of a watch out too, because it's attached to this sense that we're quite isolated. So perceptions of price can often be attached to things like miles, distance, etc., rather than value or premiumization. And I'm sure Nick has got some views on that as well. So I'm going to wrap up quickly here with I just really want to emphasize that your global audience has shifted. So if you've done research before, or you've looked at your target market before, I really encourage you just to do a little toe in the water and just say, what's changed? What's changed for them? And how does that shift the opportunity for us? Is it better, worse? Do I have to rethink my proposition? Do I have to reposition myself in order to deal with some of those insights that I've just shared with you? The good news is that New Zealand certainly has a lot more saliency. People they're no longer thinking about what we have in terms of our natural environment, but how we do it, the way that we are as a people. So that's really good, particularly if you've got IP and capability sitting behind your products or services. This is your chance to really use this opportunity to promote the fact that you are smart, clever, sophisticated, and very capable, because people are curious. Differentiation, that whole separation from Australia, particularly around food. This is an important one, because we know that often we get lumped in with that. I kind of get beef from somewhere down there in the South Pacific. I think it's Australia, it might be New Zealand. Now people are really looking and seeing New Zealand as different. In fact, in some of the US groups that we spoke to, we had a wonderful woman, and she said, look, to be perfectly honest, I didn't really know where you were, who you were, what you did. But through this whole pandemic, I kind of know who New Zealand is now, and I get a sense of who you are, and I just didn't know that before. So there's a much greater sense of knowledge and awareness. So definitely take advantage of that. We got comments that we think you're leading in certain aspects, and so there's a real sense that what we do is good for humanity, and therefore the things that we produce must be good for humanity. The things that we do must be good for humanity. So a real values-based perspective of New Zealand, and desirable. If they wanted to come before, man, they really want to come now. Some of the comments we got was, I don't think you're ever going to let us in because we aren't dealing with things as well as you. But a real greater sense of desirability. So if they can't visit, they want to explore through food, through other experiences, because we are kind of cool and interesting, and they're curious about us, so they want to know a bit more. So the door's kind of gone from being a little bit open to a lot more open. And so really I'd encourage you to build on the values that we have within New Zealand, because that's what people are really interested in. They want to know, how is it that what you do is so ingenious, but also really cares for people, place, and planet? Tell me a little bit more about that balance, because that's what I'm seeing, and they trust that there's integrity in what we do. So, you know, you can go forward, I think, with a lot more confidence, notwithstanding any other barriers that you might have. So that's about all from me. I'm just going to say that all of this research is available. Well, this particular piece is going up over the next couple of weeks, but there's a ton of research, all sorts of tools, materials, etc. That's all available on our toolkit. So go there. There's 10 of us in the team. So if you can't find what you're looking for, email us and one of us will reply really quickly.
Fantastic, Rebecca, and that's a great resource. And look, so I've got a question here for you, for those that are listening. Like, what do you think New Zealand businesses need to do? Are they speaking up enough, or do they need to shout from the rooftops more? Or how do we strike this balance from not getting ahead of ourselves, but actually really communicating this well?
Yeah, so when I say don't get ahead of yourself, certainly I wouldn't mention that, you know, our approach to COVID in your conversations unless you're asked to. I think that's a non-starter, but they're curious and they want to know more. So the comments we get, for example, from, you know, UK and Germany is, you guys just need to market yourselves better. You know, you don't spend enough time and energy and money on marketing and branding and positioning yourself here, because I don't know what exists. So, you know, this has been an issue for New Zealand for quite a long time, is that we just aren't very loud and proud. We have this whole humbleness about us. But two things. One is, you know, do it with grace and integrity. But secondly, do it now because the world's interested.
Fantastic. So that's great, Rebecca. We'll look around in a moment. And Bob, I'm kind of interested to get your perspective on what Rebecca's been sharing. Is this, you know, would you concur with what you've just seen and heard? And is there anything else that you would add?
So I absolutely concur and agree. You know, one of the things I left out of my introduction is I've been working with NZTE for 7 or 8 years. So have worked with quite a few Kiwi companies coming to the States. And so very familiar with sort of the brand New Zealand. And I think among the people I interact with, who might be retailers, brokers, investors, and others, it has a very, you know, positive connotation. And, you know, the products are viewed as being not just sort of clean and green and, you know, coming from a great provenance, but, you know, high quality and from good people. So I think it's been very positive.
Great. And do you think New Zealand, you know, in terms of the New Zealand story in America now, like obviously the product needs to stack up, but do you think we can be doing more to shout from the rooftops, as it were?
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I think, again, very positive connotations for businesses and products from New Zealand. And, you know, what you mentioned earlier about, you know, your prime minister, you know, we have, like a lot of people, prime minister envy, you know, compared to the leadership we have here. So I think that carries over in a positive way as well. Just how you dealt with, you know, some of the social problems.
Yeah, can I just quickly add to that? Because I think you're absolutely right. And we've just had a Bloomberg research piece through saying that, you know, New Zealand's #1 in terms of the crisis management is voted by Asia Pacific countries. The question I think many of the business community have is that just a leadership set of values that's being portrayed, or does that exist deeper and wider in New Zealand? And so that's where I'd say we need to speak up and participate in that reputation build.
Sure.
Interesting. Well, that's good, Bob. And so, Rachel, what about for you? Like in you know, New Zealand, and we'll hear from you in a moment in terms of what's happening there. But in terms of the New Zealand story and New Zealand companies selling into China, is that still, you know, something we need to talk more about?
Oh, definitely. Our agencies are working very closely together to make sure they use this time to market and sell that story. So, for example, Tourism New Zealand, they've got a very focused China content strategy. They've moved away from their website to social media, so to WeChat, for example, and they have picked up on this positive uptick in perceptions due to COVID, and a high desirability to visit sort of open places, small populations, land, outdoors, etc. So they're doing a lot of work to ensure that we're able to capitalise on that and keep that market warm, because if we withdraw over this period, it's going to be really difficult to get back in. The same with education, for example. They're also seeing a lot of interest due to our credentials around COVID and the perceptions around New Zealand being a very safe place.
Well, that's great. Good to hear. And then, Nick, what about for you? How's the little colonial outreach of New Zealand stacking up?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's obviously a huge familiarity with New Zealand from the UK, and almost everyone I talk to can name a relative or someone that they know is married to someone who's from New Zealand. So that kind of goes in anyone's favour when they're coming up here. And most people have an instant network on arriving. Some of the things that Rebecca said really resonated for me is the national pride side of things. I think part of that here was kicked off with Brexit. And that's really coming through in food and beverage here. Like, for example, Waitrose stopped stocking New Zealand lamb a couple of years ago. But there's definitely things like more, everything's packaged as fish that's line caught in Cornwall by someone with a big beard and a Mac and that kind of thing. And it's really probably more of a movement away from that provenance idea, but people knowing where their food came from. I don't think this kind of precludes New Zealand, but it does make it a little bit more of a difficult story. And so we're seeing things like the food miles argument coming back again, in spite of the fact that actually New Zealand even if by the time you get, say, lamb, for example, to the UK is lower in carbon cost than a lot of the land that's farmed in the UK. So there's, a few of those stories to get through. And I think that the New Zealand story and the values of New Zealand really align well with certain parts of food and beverage, or a lot of the food and beverage scene. Wine here is particularly well known, honey, I've mentioned lamb. And I think that probably the challenge for New Zealand companies is how do you market that, but also how do you take advantage of a lot of the consumer behaviour changes that we've seen in the last few months as a result of COVID. So there's, there's quite a bit in there, and how companies respond to that is really important.
Yeah, fantastic. And we'll maybe hear a bit more about what you're noticing in a moment. So, look, thanks, Rebecca, for sharing that and also getting those other perspectives from around the world there. And that's great. And so, Rachel, I'd like to move over to you there. Prior to this call here, we were talking about some interesting trade stats that have recently come out between what's happening between New Zealand exports and China. Could you share a little bit about what you noticed from that research that's come out?
So in general, what we've seen is that China has been one of the few countries in the world that, like New Zealand, has taken an elimination approach towards combating COVID. And this has been very successful. They've taken, they've had a few outbreaks relatively recently, but they've used mass testing primarily to contain those. So consumer confidence is pretty high, and China is one of the few countries in the world where GDP is actually expected to rise this year. So China has had record-breaking GDP rates of growth over the last 10 years, and so it's not going to be as fast, but it is predicted by ANZ economists to be about 1% this year. They've also had a lot of provinces have issued shopping coupons, and that's stimulating consumption also. In terms of what New Zealand is seeing, with our trade data, we've been tracking this really closely since the start of the year. And what we've been finding is that our exports have been going well, but they've tended to be below last year's levels. So they've been above 2008, but tracking a little below 2019, which was a very high base. But in just the last month, it's actually increased quite a lot. And so to the year ended August 2020, our total exports were up 7.1% to 16.8 billion. So really what has been driving that growth is milk powder. And some combination of just sort of plain milk powder, but also high value milk powder. They're starting to ship infant formula on air freight, for example, just to meet demand. We've also seen a big increase in beef and lamb. At first, that industry was quite hit by COVID, particularly around food service, but there's been really a combination of factors which have meant that those meat prices have remained really strong. So in general, about 28% of New Zealand's annual goods exports to August 2020 went to China. Usually we quote a figure of around 23%, so we can see that China is starting to take up a bigger share.
Interesting. And for the consumers in China, what are you noticing there in terms of changes in behaviour that could be relevant to what New Zealand exporters need to pay attention to?
Well, we're sort of seeing, in terms of exporters, we're seeing, I guess, mixed results within those sectors, and this is driven by a few different factors. So for food and beverage, for example, dairy, meat, pet food and vegetables are all up, but some products, for example, forestry, fruit, particularly cherries, seafood, particularly lobsters, honey, beverages and beauty have been sort of a little bit more mixed. And within that, we've got specialised manufacturing and tech and services, and they're also showing sort of mixed results. So gaming strong, while other companies that focus on the film industry, etc., might not be faring so well. Fisher and Paykel have had a huge share price increase, whilst other companies that have really needed people in market haven't been doing so well. So this has really been driven by different trends that we've been seeing. So for example, there's been a big focus on nutrition, vitamins, vitality, and our country brand focus on safety, trust and quality has really strengthened a lot of those products. Like I said earlier, food service has faced a bit of a decline but is improving, and luxury products have also dipped a little bit. And when China Skinny and others have looked at this, they've noticed that people are really focused on value for money and fresh food. So less focus on luxury, more focus on value for money. And like Rebecca was saying, we're seeing in China, I guess for the first time since I've been watching this market, which is nearly 20 years now, and this is a real buy local, and it's, obviously China is very, can be very nationalistic, but a real desire to support the nation. And traditionally, though, there hasn't been a huge amount of trust and confidence in domestic food supply, but we've seen greater confidence in domestic food supply and a greater demand for fresh produce that actually comes from China. So that's something for us to look out for. So a lot of people looking for quality and value and reputation.
Okay, and so for many New Zealand companies, more of a small, medium size, and accessing the China market can be challenging, but there is obviously the whole e-commerce approach as well, and I've heard some stats as high as 25% of consumer goods are purchased online. What are you noticing from an e-commerce point of view, or what are you hearing in regards to that?
Well, definitely. I mean, one thing I would say is that China has a completely unique and different e-commerce ecosystem. So what we've heard from NZTE and others is that e-commerce is massively accelerated and considerable support is able to be provided in that area. But a lot of New Zealand companies, particularly SMEs, are really grappling with the implementation. So essentially, if you're an SME and you're looking to engage in the China market, just be aware it's incredibly complicated, it's incredibly unique, and it's very fast moving. And so absolutely you need the right advice, and I know that there is a lot of support out there. So you've just got to spend the time making sure that you get your strategy right. So, for example, China now, its social media marketing has really taken off, and particularly around the use of KOLs and short video live streaming, and the use of unique platforms and unique apps. This is particularly prevalent for things like beauty and personal care, and also F&B.
That's fascinating there. So that's really, like, speed is one of the things there. And there was a guy, Ken, it was like a couple of months ago, who is involved in China quite a lot, and he just talked about speed and that need for getting investors for speed, because otherwise you just get left behind. So that's fantastic. And then what about from a New Zealand and China relationship at a government level? Like, out of 10, how are we looking in that regards?
Well, I mean, New Zealand and China have had a very good relationship for a long period of time. We've had diplomatic relations since 1972, and we're a country that has had a lot of firsts with China. First country to sign an FTA, developed Western country to sign an FTA, and various other things. So, I mean, the relationship is still good. Geopolitical tensions definitely can have some impact on trade, and a company actually engaging with their consumer and having a good engagement strategy can help to mitigate this. So that's another reason for making sure you know your consumer and you're engaging well with them.
That's right, fantastic. And that's the likes of what Catapult can certainly help people with. Fantastic, Rachel. Thanks for that China update, and we'll also get a little bit later on just some kind of clear actions that people can take as well. And so I'd like to move over to the UK now, and Nick. So we hear some interesting news about the Brexit issues there with the EU beginning legal actions, etc. So what's really going on the ground in the UK, and what implications does that have for New Zealand exporters?
Yeah. So, look, if you think you know what's going on, then you definitely don't when it comes to Brexit. And it's been quite well. They're quite into the deep part of the negotiations, and some of the sticking points are around things like state aid and the fisheries, which and they're looking to go into what's called the tunnel in terms of the negotiation, which is a phase where there is no ability for information to leak outside, with the idea that they can get something to the EU Commission meeting, which I think is on the 15th and 16th of October. So that's the goal of the time frame, so that an FTA can be put in place by the 31st of December. And that is the date when the UK officially leaves, well, has already left the EU, but leaves the single market and the customs union. And that's the date that no matter if an FTA between Europe and the EU and the UK is agreed or not, many things will still change. And the impacts for New Zealand companies will be felt to some extent if you're shipping from or sending goods or services from New Zealand to the UK or into the EU. But mostly the impact is between the UK and the EU. And many New Zealand companies do have operations in the UK or in the EU and are selling vice versa. So many New Zealand companies, for example, will use the UK as a base from which to then send product into the EU. What it means is the big changes are that there will be potentially tariffs if there is no trade deal struck that will go between the UK and the EU. But there will also be export and import documentation that didn't previously exist. There's changes to VAT, their equivalent of our GST systems, and a whole raft of other regulatory changes. So, for example, you might have seen the CE mark on the back of your phone or your Kindle or whatever it is. That is a conformity mark for the UK to meet for the EU to meet regulations there. And for example, the UK will is going to bring in its own mark called the UKCA. So if you're currently using the CE mark, then you would need to then bring in the UKCA mark. I am doing a separate webinar on this on the 9th of October. If anyone's interested, they can find that on the NZT website, but we'll go into a lot more detail on that information if they're curious. But that's just sort of one thing that is sitting in the background and coming very much to the foreground now for UK companies. But obviously COVID's been a very big change. And I'm not sure if you saw, but last week there's been two announcements from the UK government, changes and restrictions to how we operate, and a comment there from the Prime Minister that these may last for 6 months, which I think was a really big wake-up call for the country, and one that was quite frankly a little bit depressing when you think about the curtailment of our daily life. And the second one was just changes to what the furlough scheme that they have here, which is something that's helping keep the economy going. There's currently 3 million people in the UK who are on the furlough scheme. I mean, that was set to end on the 31st of October. And it will end, but they're bringing in a new scheme from the 1st of November for 6 months after that. And that will help keep the economy going through what's a critical period with Brexit coming on the 31st of December. Yeah. A lot in that, Hamish. So.
There's quite a bit there to unpack. So for New Zealand businesses doing business with UK businesses like distributors or retailers, like, are we able to get their attention, or is their attention just somewhere else, like involved?
Yeah, well, early on it was somewhere else. Now it's not. We are, if for example, an F&B in contact with buyers, there's some really interesting things coming out of COVID. It picks winners and losers, as you will have heard from Rachel as well. But I was just looking earlier this week at some wine stats, and for the last 12 weeks of this year, and if you compare that to the same 12 weeks of last year, total volume of New Zealand wine in the UK is up 25%, 32% of value, and if you look at the £7 to £8 price category, that's up 48% in value, and the £8 to £9, 53% in value. So there's been really big changes because of the way consumers are changing their behaviour. And just as a side note in that report, I saw tequila sales are up and whiskey sales are down. And who would have thought? You just would. I don't know why, but so what we're seeing is changes in what people are buying, but also a lot, and I think Rachel touched on this, on how people are buying as well. So, for example, when everyone came out of lockdown here in late July, early August, the footfall in retail high streets was at about 60 to 70% of the level that had been seen at the same time the previous year. However, in early August, we actually reached parity of consumer spending to the previous year, and it went 10% above in August. People had saved up a bunch of money, I suppose, in March and felt they wanted to buy something. So what that's saying is people aren't going to the high street as much, and they're buying online a whole lot more. And my local courier delivered something to me today, and he said that their company had announced that they were going to employ 3,000 new drivers before the end of the year.
Yeah.
So it's just the change in what people are consuming and how they're consuming it is huge.
That's right. Yeah. So that massive. UK is already the high adoption rate of online purchasing, and that's obviously just gone to another level, and certainly a way for New Zealand companies to be reaching these new markets is via e-commerce, whether it's their own website or marketplaces like Amazon or eBay.
And there has been a big uptake, although it's not hugely significant, but a lot more people selling through social media. So, and that's been a big change. So particularly on Instagram, we've been working with a lot of New Zealand companies over here doing that. The beauty of the UK is sophisticated market, a reasonable sized population, there is some income there to spend on those types of items, but it's relatively small and easy to get around when it comes to logistics point of view. So fulfillment is not a huge issue. So that's where this boom is sort of happening.
Yeah, fantastic.
And lots of opportunity, I think, there for New Zealand companies if they can get it right on that behaviour and on how people are buying as well.
Correct, yeah, and it always comes back to, and I mentioned this on the last call here, and there was a comment from a guy out of Korea saying you want to be selling products that are for that market as well. So it's not just about, hey, I've got an amazing product here, who wants to buy it? It's like putting yourself in the shoes of the consumers in these markets, the UK, Europe, US, China, and going, what would appeal to them? And you're taking that messaging that Rebecca's talking about and lining that up. So fantastic. Hey, thanks, Nick, on that, and we'll hopefully see if we can get a bit more, but I'm conscious of the time. I want to get over to Bob to hear a bit more about the US. So I always find the US fascinating, Bob, and no more in times like this when an election's looming and the polarization you see of different viewpoints, and what we see on the news here, I know, is maybe not the full picture in terms of rioting, etc., and this unrest. But what's the real story going on the ground in terms of consumer behaviour and how that's going to link to New Zealand exporters?
Sure. So one of the questions I sort of thought about was as we're sort of going into our colder season, obviously the big seismic event looming is our national election. So that happens on November 3rd, and all the things you said are true. It's not like there's, maybe the rioting and the civil unrest is amplified when you see it on the news in terms of it's not happening in every community or every major city. But certainly I think the polarization is valid. And I think the outcome of the election is going to have so many implications around national policies dealing with COVID, impact on the macroeconomy, things around deregulation, other big problems, climate change, et cetera, how all that unfolds over the next, 4 years after this. So it is a massive event that's just there, that's going to impact a lot of things that are happening going forward. Now, a lot of the companies I work with are food and beverage, although I do a fair amount with supplements, personal care, other CPG, consumer packaged goods categories. One of the hardest hit sectors has been on-premise, food service. A lot of these operators have sort of limped through the summer, having some amount of takeaway, takeout, cocktails to go, just trying to stay alive. As things relaxed a little bit, there was a lot more in the way of outdoor seating. And so that gave them a little bit of running room for those who could do that. But now as the weather's getting colder, there's causing a lot of concerns in that sector because there's been a run on propane heaters. They're essentially not available anymore. And, as every month goes by, I would say a lot of people are concerned about eating indoors, even with appropriate distancing. And we're just going to get to where, as we get into our late October, November, December, it's going to be probably too cold for most people to be sitting outside. On the retail side, retailers are already gearing up for our US Thanksgiving, which is the third week in November, as well as the Christmas and Hanukkah and New Year holidays. And there's concerns around transportation availability and capacity. So just, trucking with all of the growth with e-com and Amazon and all of that, aging of drivers, just transportation capacity in general has been a bottleneck for a lot of this moving stuff around. And retailers who were really burned early in the pandemic in terms of the unexpected surge in demand are already loading up stores now. For those of you who might read the Wall Street Journal, there was a big story earlier this week about they're loading in a lot of inventory of staples and, everything, both in anticipation of the holiday high season for shopping, but also, the possibility of a second COVID wave, as well as seasonal flu and other things that will be highly disruptive. So when that ripples out to suppliers, a lot of the companies I'm working with, it's sort of, wreaking havoc on demand planning, production scheduling, inventory, all the normal kinds of things. So, and it's disconnected from consumer takeaway off the shelf, so hard to predict. So that's a reality that's facing a lot of folks. And then, continuing on a little bit, we still have upwards of 9% unemployment in the States. And so that's, close to 30 million people. There's a lot of focus on value, providing value to the consumer. So whereas demand was high and promotions were cut, retailers are putting a lot of pressure on suppliers to come back with promotions and being price conscious and all of that. And also, paring back a little bit on selection and assortment. So thinking in terms of 80-20, in terms of what they're offering. So focusing on essentials. The whole move towards omni-channel, so not just e-com and Amazon, but just everything from home delivery, curbside pickup, et cetera, all accelerated, all still growing at a very rapid rate. So everyone's adapting to meet that reality. There's also been an impact sometimes on brand loyalty because of out of stock. So, a regular brand that you might buy every week is unavailable for a while. So you're trying new things. So it's a little bit of a blessing in disguise for younger, earlier stage brands who would otherwise have a problem with discovery in the absence of things like in-store tastings and promotions and other things like that. And then, this whole business of people settling in at home, so whether it's catching up on DIY projects, it's catching up on their binge watching, settling in and adapting to homeschooling, which is, I can only imagine. Thankfully, our kids are out of university, so that's behind us, but it's got to be so difficult. And so that's just, something that was referred to earlier by some of the other panelists as just everyday consumer behaviors just changing quite dramatically.
Interesting, fascinating. And so I'm curious, from a New Zealand, say, SME food and beverage producer, which I know there'll be plenty listening to this here, how do we navigate this this potential challenge around, the consumers and retailers' demand for better value when we've got this distance part and the freight aspect, and often it means that we have to be at that premium. How do we get that premium message across in a way that's going to have consumers in the US buy?
Well, I mean, it's where Rebecca started. I mean, it's all about storytelling. And how do you get that story across? How do you amplify it? How do you emphasize it and justify it both factually in terms of features, benefits, etc., but also emotionally in terms of how people feel about buying products from New Zealand. So the majority of companies I work with are premium brands, so they're all value added, premium, natural, organic, non-GMO, antibiotic-free, hormone-free, etc., who all come at a premium price. And so when I talk about an emphasis on value, it's what we're hearing from retailers and others about, maybe being a little more aggressive on promotional spending and other things to help make these products more accessible to more people. So, but not devaluing what you have in its core.
Fantastic. Excellent, Bob. And we could talk a whole lot more, and I'm conscious of the time that time has been, we're now 5 minutes to go. So I think let's kind of get a bit of feedback from around the room. And Rachel, I'll start with you. So what's one action or two actions that you think New Zealand exporters can take as they perhaps consider China or look at how they improve their exporting to China?
Okay, so the roughly half the amount of people that are on the call that haven't exported yet to China, make sure that you've got your IP sorted. So China is a first to file country, which means that you have to be first in. So make sure you've got your brand name, make sure you can check that you can protect it, and make sure that it's protected before you do anything else. So that's for them. And then for the other 50% that are already exporting, it's really about those digital channels. So right connections, right way, right channel, research. Use everything that NZTE and others have got there to help you.
Yeah. And I think that's been one of the great things this year, has been the visibility. Like, New Zealand Trade Enterprise have been there, NZ Story's been there, but really probably companies hadn't tapped into that as much. And I think now is like the perfect time to be looking at those resources. Even Rebecca, if you could just again put into the chat there for everyone just the address to go to, and likewise if you could as well, Rachel, with the NZ China Council as well. And I think just perfect to be tapping into these resources. So that's great. And then Nick, over to you in London. Some actions that New Zealand exporters can be taking as they look at particularly this change coming up with the UK-Europe breakup and what they need to be really focusing on to make sure that they get the lack of, less disruption to the economy.
Well, understanding what the risks you're exposed to around Brexit are, and then what the mitigations are around that. And actually, the NZT website has a lot of good information around what those risks may be for New Zealand companies, and links to appropriate sites as well to help them work through that. The big things that we're seeing, and it's difficult because people can't travel as much at the moment, that is getting your market validation right, and getting your product market fit right, and understanding it. And that comes back to what Bob was talking about telling that story. telling a great story is really good, but you've got to have somebody who wants to listen to your story. Otherwise, you're just talking to yourself. So the thing that we're really big on is the money spent in validating and getting the product market fit right saves so much further down the track. And when I go through and read funding closeout reports that NZT has been involved in, it's always, I wish I'd known at the end what I knew at the start. And that's what market validation tells you. And often you can't put a price on that because you haven't felt the pain of it. And there'll be people on the call who have felt the pain and know what I'm talking about. And I think that's a really important step for New Zealand businesses if they're looking to come to the UK and then on into Europe. And I would still say that's a good path for New Zealand companies in spite of Brexit, because there's still going to be a lot of trade going on between the EU and the UK.
Yeah, fantastic. Good stuff. Yeah, that's it is so critical, whether it's the UK, Europe, or China or the US, that validation is key. And again, that's where there's a great resource there with NZT and other companies like Catapult that can really help with that. So Bob, over to you there. So how do New Zealand companies, what's a key action that New Zealand exporters can be thinking of right now as they go, well, how do we get into the US? And
so in addition to what's been said, right, about doing your homework and all, it's first of all understanding the US is not a homogeneous market, right? It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small markets, both regionally as well as channels and classes of trade and all of that. For most people on the call, I would absolutely leverage NZTE. They have offices in LA and New York. And there's a wide network of people like myself who are part of the Beachhead Advisors group. So various folks who understand everything from e-commerce and direct-to-consumer to food service sector, retail sector, and just in food and beverage, and then other people in other industries and other verticals. So leveraging that, I think, would be really good. And then for most products that are, just talking to food and beverage that are, say, ambient, you can always start online, e-commerce, get national exposure without the tremendous expense of an investment of going into bricks and mortar. And when you are testing bricks and mortar, to pick a region and pilot it and see evidence of selling off the shelf. So, make sure you get all your variables right, that you're selling through, and not just filling a pipeline of sales, getting a new distribution.
Fantastic. And actually through this year, just with the increase in online shopping, like I know Amazon loans up 25%, and there's been brands that have started on Amazon and then they get noticed by distributors. And
absolutely
adding power changes, because you go, well, I've got evidence here. You can even see where people are buying, where they're from, zip codes. So that can help dictate your brick and mortar strategy as well. So
exactly,
and particularly given we can't get on planes nowadays, the e-commerce approach is certainly important. So again, thanks.
One thing I'm sorry, Hamish, I just want to say, interestingly, retail buyers are more accessible than ever. And a lot of smaller companies that otherwise might have a challenge of getting FaceTime are able to schedule Zoom calls, arrange for samples either to be sent to the office or to the buyer's home. And, there's quite a number of companies that I've worked with from New Zealand who are having some success, at least getting a foothold into some of these bricks and mortar retail stores.
Yeah, I'd support that too, and just say some of the comments we've had, particularly out of the US, is whilst you do seem far away, the whole world is now at the same level. There is no time difference or distance because of Zoom and meetings. So don't hesitate to get on a call.
That's great. And Rebecca, as you found with the the survey approach being online, and like people's habits have changed, and so now we can't do trade shows, but you can do Zoom calls, and so people are open to that. And Rebecca, I'd like to finish with you, given just to close the loop there with the New Zealand story. So what are you some advice or an action for those listening to take that will help them with their export journey?
Fortunately, it's been covered by the other three. I would just say that if you've got that travel budget sitting there from last year, think about using that in a different way. Think about using that for validation, for improving your proposition, making sure you've really got your brand proposition tight and clear, and that you understand your target audience that you're going after, and be focused and probably narrow things down a wee bit. That's my advice.
Fantastic. Yeah, that is very good advice, and that 80-20 principle, arguably less but better, and focused is what certainly pays off in the export market. So, look, I am conscious we are past time. There are some questions there that we will perhaps have a quick look at before, well, I know people are going to go, and then we'll maybe answer those just as people are dropping off. But thank you very much, Bob, Nick, Rachel, and Rebecca, for being here. Really do appreciate it, and fantastic words of advice there for all those listening. So really appreciate it, and thank you also for those that have attended, and much appreciated. Hopefully you found that very useful, and we'll hopefully see you again in November. Probably we'll have one more before Christmas in terms of an update, and again, do look out for those resources off NZ Story, NZTE, New Zealand China Council, and also connect with Bob Burke if you are looking into the US there, and also Catapult or Cell Global there. So thank you very much, everyone. So if you need to pop off, that'd be great. And then I think if panelists there, if you do have a moment here, we'll quickly answer these questions here that people put in late in the piece. There were no questions up until about like 1 minute to go. So we'll see what we can answer here. So we do have this from Robbie Clapham. So we've got Bob. We run a Manuka honey company here and are looking into the US and are finding it very difficult to find a good 3PL in the USA that we can trust and use as a B2C and B2B base. Just wondering if you have any advice on good 3PLs. So he's got his email there. If you do know that, that'd be useful.
Yeah.
So Robbie.
Yeah. So I'll take that email and I will send him an email. So I don't know specific 3PLs by name, but I know people who do. And so I can either connect them up with a company that specializes in back office and back of the house logistical services, as well as, even the people at NZTE who I'm sure have a number of companies they're aware of.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. And then Rebecca was also just making a comment here on the Fernmark side of things. So it's a really good point there. So we'll put those in the show notes there. And yeah, and just reiterating Rachel's comment there, just around IP in China, the same goes for the USA and or any other country. Like do that very early on in your journey. Otherwise, you'll find that can become a problem. So there was here Fiona just clarifying, Rebecca, is the Buy New Zealand made as well regarded as Fernmark?
Buy New Zealand made is largely, has always been a domestic oriented program. So it's a buy local support. They don't have the trademark protection overseas that the Fernmark has. So we've protected that Fernmark license in 15 countries across 42 classes. So once you put that on your packaging, it gives you a great deal of protection. So we monitor that, and if anyone's ripping off your packaging or pretending to be you or using it inappropriately, we tend to send them a nice little letter and it gets stopped pretty quickly. So it's another course of action you can take to protect your brand without a lot of legal costs attached to it. So check it out, it's pretty affordable, about $7.50 for a small business a year. And we turn that around in about 7 to 10 days.
Fantastic. Hey, that's actually really good. Fantastic. Thanks, Rebecca. Also, there we go. Shane Lowe was saying he's also got some other 3PL agents there. And there we go. Every day is a school day. I'm not sure that. Anyway, learning that. Hey, look, so thank you, everyone. We'll wrap it up now. Again, thanks, Bob. Nick, time for you to get to bed over there. And Rachel.
Thanks,
thank you, Rebecca, also. All right.
Pleasure.
Great seeing you all. Thanks.
Have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.